The Civil War Part 2. So in this slide, we see both sides face political problems. We're going to summarize these real quickly for you. The first one will be habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is going to be set aside by Lincoln. Remember, habeas corpus means that authorities, police officers, and all this good stuff, authorities cannot hold you in jail longer than 48 hours without being charged with a crime. All right, so why would Lincoln suspend habeas corpus and hold people in prison and in jail for like almost 3 years, 4 years? Spies, espionage. He says, we don't know if you're a spy, but I think you're a spy. So, especially along the border states. Jefferson Davis, he also will have the power to do this, and he tries to do this as well, once again dealing with spies. Chief Justice Robert Taney, he rules that Lincoln was unconstitutional and overstepped his powers by suspending habeas corpus. However, Lincoln sets precedent just like Andrew Jackson did in 1832, and he ignores the Supreme Court's ruling, just like I said, just like Jackson had done with Worcester versus Georgia, and he ignores the ruling and continues to imprison people for about 2.5 to 3 years. Peace Democrats, they wanted to end the war and preserve the Union through negotiations. Republicans would see the Democrats as an act of treason. This would be an act of treason. And they called them copperheads, a venomous snake that can snap up and bite you. So remember, Lincoln's overall goal is to preserve the Union. And so if you negotiate a peace treaty with the South, this is condoning that their government is legal. So this would go against what Lincoln's trying to do. Conscription. Confederates began to do this in 1862, and the Union will follow in 1863. Conscription is a fancy word for the draft. It's where the government will mandate that soldiers or citizens have to become soldiers. But if you look here, 92% of the Union made up of volunteers. In the North, the African American draft, the black draft, started in 1862, and in the South, yes, the South did force slaves to fight in the Confederacy in 1865. So life during the war. African American soldiers, as you see, blacks in the North and South, were not allowed to fight when the war started. As I said, in 1862, Congress will allow them to enlist. And when did large numbers of African Americans enlist? After the Emancipation Proclamation was issued January 1st, 1863. They're still going to be paid less than white soldiers, $3 a day, and they were forced to serve in all black regiments. They fight in over 500 battles in the Civil War, and they fight extremely well. They had to also pay for their own clothes. Pay is finally going to be equalized in 1864, and as I said, the South will draft slaves in 1865 because they were desperate for men. Slave resistance in the Confederacy. In the South, white men had to go off and fight, leaving women and children behind to run the plantations and run the estates. Slaves would sabotage work on the plantations. They would do poor work, they would break equipment, they would neglect livestock, and they would tear down fences. So these are some things they would do. They would typically do this from time to time when the master was there, or when the ownership or the rest of the family was there, but they did it more during the Civil War. So fear is going to sweep through the South because people would fear slave uprisings and that women and children would be left behind and left to fend for themselves. So the war affects regional economies. In the South, shortages are going to hurt the war effort. There were three major factors here: drain of manpower into the Army, Union occupation of food areas, loss of slaves to work in the fields. Food riots were common. North Carolina had two major food riots, one in Yancey County and one in Rowan County. And both of these food riots were led by women. In response to the Union blockade, the South developed blockade runners, ships that could move quick enough through these blockade lines to try to smuggle goods into and out of the South. One of the major ports in the east was Wilmington, North Carolina. The North, as you see, the war affected the North's economy in a much more positive way. The economy in the North boomed. The need for raw materials and produced materials increased. Technology, basically, you're looking at reapers for farmers. They could do the work of 10 men with one machine. So we start to see a lot of labor-saving machines develop during the war. Due to the economic growth, Congress would collect its first income tax in 1863. They will collect income taxes during the war, but then they're not going to collect income taxes until the 20th century. They will stop collecting income taxes after the war's over. So soldiers suffer on both sides. As you see, both sides suffered through the war, and both thought it would be a short and glorious war. However, as you see here, you got heavy casualties, unhealthy conditions, limited food, inadequate medical care were some of the real-life conditions for these soldiers. Soldiers lived with garbage, spoiled food, open pits of human waste, and living with the dead bodies around them on the battlefield, sometimes using the dead bodies to cloak them, to cover them up. Most soldiers went weeks without bathing, washing their clothes, so the soldiers are going to smell. Guys, dysentery is going to be a big thing. Of course, melancholy is always a big thing, which today we call it PTSD. So, prisons and during the Civil War, as you see, Andersonville, Georgia is famous for not sheltering Union prisoners. They're very, very poor condition. If you look down at the bottom right-hand corner, this gentleman right here, this is a survivor of Andersonville. You could compare him to a Holocaust survivor. He was pretty much treated very much the same way. Also, you have Union prison camps in Elmira, New York, and Camp Douglas in Illinois and Chicago. Those prison camps were just as bad as Andersonville. So conditions were horrible for these soldiers who were held prisoner. As you see, working to improve conditions soon after Fort Sumter fell, the federal government set up the U.S. Sanitary Commission, and it has two goals: to improve hygienic conditions of the Army Corps and to recruit and train nurses. If you look here, this is a medical tent, and you see here there is, I think it is a saw, and they're getting ready to saw off a leg. Amputations were very common during the Civil War. So the North's going to take charge. The armies clash at Gettysburg. As you see, 1863 turns out to be a very critical year in this war. The prelude to Gettysburg, just to kind of give you some quick background, the South defeated the Union in Chancellorsville. It's going to be the last significant victory for the South. However, they're going to lose a very important general. They lose Stonewall Jackson. He's going to die on May 10th, and how he dies is basically he rides out to survey the landscape after the battle's over. As he's riding back to his camp, he's riding away from the sun. So basically his soldiers just see a silhouette of a man, and they shoot him, and they had to amputate his left arm. So his left arm contracts gangrene, and he dies. Robert E. Lee is said to have made the statement, "He lost his left arm, but I lost my right hand," because Stonewall Jackson was Robert E. Lee's right-hand man as far as like aggressive strategic planning in all these battles. Gettysburg will be the first battle without Stonewall Jackson too. So Gettysburg happens on July 1st through 3rd. It lasted for 3 days. The battle turns in the North's favor, and it's known as the turning point of the war. So it's going to turn the war in the North's favor. So it happens in a little town in Pennsylvania, Gettysburg, and basically what's trying to happen here, what Robert E. Lee's trying to do, is to invade Washington from the north, not the south. So anyway, and it happens actually on accident. These soldiers just happen to run into each other, north and south, and so what comes out of this is the North gets the high ground, the South has the low ground. leads to the third day, where you have George Pickett in his last stand. General Longstreet, who had just been promoted and replaced Stonewall Jackson, orders his forces, including Pickett's, to march into the center of the Union line after a whole morning of being barraged with artillery. Unfortunately for the artillery that was supposed to hit the Union line, it hit about 100 feet behind the soldiers, so it didn't kill any Union soldiers like it was supposed to. So as these troops, of course the South didn't know this at the time, these troops march across this field, this farmland, and only when the Confederates get close enough for gun and cannon shot do the Union soldiers open fire. So the South's forced to retreat. I believe Pickett loses around 12,000 to 15,000 soldiers, somewhere along in there, something like that. And the South forced to retreat. As Pickett comes back to the line, Robert E. Lee says, "I'm sorry" to him. And he says, "Just gather your troops and we'll make an organized retreat." And Pickett replied, "I have no troops left." So for the rest of his life, George Pickett will not like Robert E. Lee, and they were best friends before this battle. But for the rest of Pickett's life, he blames Lee for this. It is also the last time a Napoleonic strategy is used as a base of a military planning. So if you look, here's where we were talking about. So this is Pickett's last charge right here. As you see, here's the second where the Confederacy tried to get through the day before. So Vicksburg happens Vicksburg is one of the last strongholds of the Confederates on the Mississippi River. Remember, the Union's goal was to conquer the Mississippi and cut the Confederacy in half. So after a long, I think it's about a month-long siege of Vicksburg, on July 4th, the day after Gettysburg, on July 4th, the city falls. So 5 days later, Port Hudson, Louisiana. It is the last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi falls, and so now, as of July 9th, 10th, the Confederacy is cut in two. The Gettysburg Address was given on November 19th, 1863. This is Lincoln's speech. It only lasts about 2 minutes, 270 words. Lincoln felt the speech was flat. So did the others at the dedication of this national cemetery. The speech actually reshapes American thinking. Before the war, people saw themselves as part of separate parts to the Union, and after the war, we see ourselves as part of a Union, as part of America, as part of the U.S. So it totally reshapes our mindset. It's one of the most important speeches you need to read in American history to understand where we are today. And just to kind of throw this out there at you, Everett Everest, I believe that was his name. He was a famous poet at the time. He gave a 2-hour speech, a poem, and after Lincoln's speech, he come up to President Lincoln and said, "Sir, you said in 2 minutes what I couldn't say in 2 hours." So there were some people there that understood what Lincoln was saying. Battleground of Vicksburg. So the Confederacy wears down. As you see, after Gettysburg and Vicksburg, the South could only hope to slow Northern advances. Confederates had limited manpower. They didn't have the manpower the North had to draw from. Morale in the Confederacy deteriorated. Men desert the army. They go back home. They write letters from home are discussing bad conditions. Farmers resented having to pay taxes that took part of their food supply. Did the rich have to pay? No. If you owned 20 slaves or more, you did not have to pay that tax. Remember, it's a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Confederacy Congress is in disarray. In 1863, North Carolina wanted out of the war and wanted peace. Our economy, as you see, people were starving to death. Families were starving to death. And once again, the Yancey County and Rowan County food riots.